You know, I have a seeing eye dog. I left the dog under the table so you couldn't see her lips move while I was speaking. You're also all aware that a few months ago, the great state of Pennsylvania, the great state of Massachusetts and its citizens rejected a popular initiative to allow assisted suicide. That was a very bad bill, and the people of Massachusetts recognized it. The bill that is introduced today, HB 4465, 6645, is far worse. The bill in Massachusetts provided a 15-day waiting period between the time an individual received the terminal diagnosis and the time the person had the lethal dose in hand. Certainly, 2 weeks is not enough time for someone to acclimate themselves to a diagnosis that one has a terminal condition and be able to make a full and informed decision concerning the end of life. Under 6645, the individual can receive the lethal dose the day that the person receives that terminal diagnosis. Clearly, that's not the recognition of choice. Clearly, it's not a full and informed choice for an individual to receive a dose that would end their lives the day they were told that they had the terminal condition. Under the Massachusetts law that was rejected by the people of that state, 2 physicians were required to make an initial determination whether an individual had clinical depression. Now, one of the problems is that most doctors aren't trained to recognize clinical depression. And the reason that's relevant is because 95%, according to the Supreme Court of the United States, of all people who decide on suicide are clinically depressed. And for many of them, if they receive adequate care, adequate psychiatric treatment, they forego the decision to commit assisted suicide. So it's very important at the initial stage that somebody who is trained in recognizing clinical depression be able to evaluate that person. Under the Massachusetts law that was rejected by its citizens, the 2 doctors involved in the initial diagnosis and the confirmation of the diagnosis of the terminal condition don't have to have any clinical training in recognizing depression. Under the even worse Connecticut bill, 6645, only 1 doctor, when all is said and done, is required to make that determination of whether the person is clinically depressed. If the attending physician, the physician who makes the initial diagnosis that the terminal condition is present, decides that there is no need for a second opinion, then that second opinion can be waived, even the second opinion concerning whether depression may be present. Now, where the 2 bills are the same include that under both the bad Massachusetts law and 6645, an heir that is interested in the estate who would benefit from the death of the individual can be one of those people attesting to the competency of the patient at the time they sign the statement asking for the lethal dosage. And that interested heir under both Massachusetts, the law that wasn't passed, and 6645, can be the only persons present at the time the lethal dose is taken. There is no requirement in the Massachusetts law, there is no requirement in 6645 that an objective person be present when the dose is taken. Even condemned criminals are entitled to have objective witnesses to ensure that the execution is done humanely. Neither Massachusetts law that was rejected or the Connecticut law requires that somebody objective be present. The possibility for elder abuse is enormous. Additionally, both laws, Massachusetts and Connecticut, cross the line from assisted suicide to euthanasia. The reason that they do it is because if you look at the definition of self-administer, the Connecticut law 6645, like its Massachusetts counterpart, said that the medication has to be self-administered. But if you look at the definition, self-administration means only that the patient has to ingest the medication. If somebody gives it to you or puts it in your mouth or jams it down your throat, you've ingested it. Additionally, both laws, the Massachusetts law that was rejected by the citizens of Massachusetts as a bad law, and 6645, engage in Orwellian newspeak. Government officials are not permitted under 6645 to call assisted suicide by name. They have to use the euphemism aid in dying, and doctors are required to lie on the death certificate to say that the individual died not because of the lethal dose, but because of the underlying terminal condition. If a terminal patient walked out of his doctor's office and was hit by a drunk driver, we wouldn't say that that person died from cancer or from Parkinson's disease or from MD. We would say that person died because they were involved in an act that was a criminal homicide. Yet under 6645 and under the Massachusetts law that was rejected by the citizens of Massachusetts, doctors are required to falsify the death certificate. It's quite possible that family members will never know that their loved one actually took a lethal dose of medication in their lives. Another problem with the law is that, and I'm sure some other speakers will address this in more detail, it creates the possibility for its extension to disabled people. If you look at the statistics that's come out of Oregon, Oregon, as you know, has had an assisted suicide law on its book for a number of years. The overwhelming reason why people in Oregon have chosen to end their lives with lethal medication is not because they were afraid of intractable pain. It's because they thought they'd be a burden to their families and that they would lose dignity and self-autonomy. Well, those are the reasons that disabled people are socialized in this society to think that they're second class. And if you think legislatures who would vote for 6645 because they think somebody with a terminal condition shouldn't live for the next 6 months, thinking that their life had no dignity, that they lost autonomy, and that they were a burden to their relatives, just think of how they would respond to the argument that I'm a quadriplegic. My lifespan is another 30 years. Should I be required to live as a burden, to live without dignity, to live with a lack of autonomy for the next 30 years when you allowed that class of people assisted suicide and the lethal dose only because they had 6 months or less to live? So the line between terminal condition, which after all is just another form of disability, and other disabling conditions is quite possibly blurrable. Justice Cardozo once said that the law extends to the legal limit of its logic. And you can well see that what happened in the Netherlands, where the Netherlands went from assisted suicide for terminal patients to assisted suicide for people who had severe physical conditions, to assisted suicide for people with psychiatric conditions, to voluntary, then avoluntary, then involuntary euthanasia. You can see that it could well happen here. It is somewhat difficult, when all is said and done, to accept the premise underlying these legislations, whether it be 6645 or the Massachusetts law or the bill that was rejected by the New Hampshire legislature. By the way, no legislature in the United States has actually accepted an aid in dying bill. The only times it's been accepted is because of popular referendum, when people could be provided the information in 15-second news bites, rather than through a deliberative, thoughtful process. But it is difficult to understand the rationale that says, because I'm a burden to others, because I lack self-autonomy, because I'm not loved, then I should kill myself. Shouldn't the response be, you are loved. You aren't a burden to us. You do have worth. Please don't die. Thank you very much.